it's very unlikely that certain people are entirely left-brained or entirely right-brained. So
Right.
it doesn't quite work that simply. And it also does relate in some ways to the learning styles myth, because a lot of teachers and other entrepreneurs will say, oh, gee, let's give this person a test to see whether they're more a left brain or right brain person or something, and then try to then give them some advice as to how to proceed with that. It's very unlikely that's going to work because, again, what people forget is that, guess what, we're complicated as humans, and rarely are people entirely verbal or entirely spatial, entirely analytical. Although these things are very domain specific, so many of us can be quite analytical in the case of some problems, especially something we know well. And then when it comes to other things, particularly when strong emotion kicks in, when we have motivated reasoning, but oftentimes logic analysis goes out the window.
Yep.
Welcome to Think Bigger, Think Better, where we explore how you can apply insights from visionary leaders and the most provocative philosophers and scientists of our time to make your life and our world a better place. Here's your host, author and speaker, Paul Gibbons.
Hey, welcome back to Think Bigger, Think Better. Thanks for your kind comments on Massimo Pigliucci. He was our most popular guest so far. We talked about Stoicism, mindfulness, science and pseudoscience, and scientism. If you haven't heard that episode, it's the one that immediately precedes this one. Today, we have a fascinating guest. We're going to talk about psychological mythology. How many of those things that you believe from the media or from your reading or from your common sense understanding of how people tick might be mythology? And if they're false, how many of them might be harmful? So before we get into that, let me tell you how I met Scott Lilienfeld. I went to write a book on business change. And during the writing of that book, I wrote a list of change myths. And of course, while I was at that, I wondered whether there were, like my list of change myths, a list of psychological myths. I stumbled across Scott's book, which is called 50 Psychological Myths and How They're Harmful. After all, change involves changing people, which is psychology. So what were some of the myths that I still had? And I discovered in the pages of that book many, many things, and I have training in psychology, that I believe that were false, that were demonstrably false by research. And so I became interested in his work. And then later on, while writing the book, I wanted to write a chapter on neuroscience. And sure enough, Scott Lilienfeld has another book on neuroscience called Brainwashed: The Trouble with Mindless Neuroscience. So as an irresistible title, I picked it up, and basically he says that we are overstating the case. And many of the applications that you read in the popular press, this is your mind, this is your brain on sex, or this is your brain on gluten, those are overstated claims. And so we need to be cautious. And Scott and I get into that later on. And then finally, Scott's most recent research project is on mental illness. And his book, just recently out, is called Facts and Fictions in Mental Health. And we get to talk about that. So those are the three topics for today: psychological myths, neuroscience, and mental illness. I want to invite you again to review the podcast on iTunes. And if you do, send me an email saying that you've done so, and I will send you a book from one of our best-selling authors. So very excited to get into this. Scott Lilienfeld, professor at Emory University, trained as a clinical psychologist, much more broadly interested now. His topics are assessment of personality disorders, especially psychopathic personality disorders, personality assessment, classification and diagnosis of psychiatric diseases, pseudoscience and clinical psychology, evidence-based clinical practice, and scientific thinking and how it applies to psychology, and the philosophy of psychology. So I'm very excited to get onto the show. And now let me welcome Scott Lilienfeld. Scott, welcome to Think Bigger, Think Better. I'm a huge fan of your work, as I said, but let me get right to the point if I may. Why might psychological myths, such as those that you cover in your book, Myths of Popular Psychology, why might it be harmful for people to believe those?
Well, thanks for having me, Paul. It's good to be here, and I appreciate the kind words. So one of the things that motivated us to write our book and some other writings is that, in our view, what my late good friend Barry Beierstein called psychomythology can sometimes be not just misleading, but potentially harmful, as you know. And one of the things we detail in the book, and we try to do elsewhere, is the myriad ways in which some of these myths can not just trip up psychology students and even some of us psychology educators, but also cause real world problems. So myths about memory, for example, can, in our view, cause all kinds of problems, wreak all kind of havoc in the courtroom, and maybe sometimes lead to false confessions and lead to incorrect eyewitness identifications. False beliefs about emotions can maybe screw up our relationships, particularly if we expect that certain emotions are going to change more rapidly than we think. Myths about learning, I think, can cause problems in the classroom and lead teachers to use ineffective or harmful interventions and so on. So one thing about psychology, I've always viewed it as sort of a double-edged sword. I think one of the wonderful things about psychology is it spreads its tentacles into so many different areas of everyday life, just about every area, which is great. I think the downside, though, is because it seems so familiar to people, it may seem kind of easy, because we're all psychologists in everyday life. We have to be psychologists. So we all know about memory and dreams and learning and stuff like that. But we may think we know more than we actually do.
Yeah, it's an area rife for cognitive biases, isn't it, really? Because, I mean, we all, as you say, you've been practicing since you're 3 years old, trying to understand the internal worlds of people, their motivations, their emotional life, their mind, what makes them tick, and all of that. So by the time we get to any kind of reasonable age, we reckon we're, quote unquote, pretty good with people. And I've met people who are really bad with people who think that they're really good with people. So,
versa. Some people, I know there's some people, I know some clinicians I would describe as very modest, but they're actually remarkably perceptive. So
yeah,
I'm not, people's confidence about how good they are as people persons is all that correlated with how good they really are. So.
What's that called? I always forget the name for that. There's an inverse correlation between how ignorant someone is and how confident they are in their beliefs. I can't recall the.
It's called there are different versions of it, but the most common name is the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Dunning-Kruger, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So the double curse of incompetence, that we're kind of in the domain. I mean, we're all incompetent in some domains, right? And if you take the domains where we're incompetent, we're kind of incompetent about our incompetence because we don't know enough to know what we don't know. So.
That's true. But I mean, someone like that could never get into power, say, like a senator or a president. I mean, it could never happen, right?
Well, we know that presidents, especially in the U.S., have to be very modest, humble people, well aware of their limitations.
Of course, yes. So anyway, let's talk about a couple of these in specifics, because I'm sure listeners, I mean, I always find someone who follows perhaps your line of thought on these things, I get to be the jerk at the dinner party when the adults are talking about, oh, look at those kids, they've had sugar. And I should probably hold my tongue. But of course, that's one of the myths of physiology is sugar has no effect on arousal. So it's a good way to be unpopular. And I think one of the ones that's held most dearly by people who do the work that I do in business is learning styles. They love that. So many of these things pass for truths, but let's talk about 2 or 3 of them and what research actually says. Let's talk maybe first about learning styles, because that's one my business people love. What's up with that? What does the research say?
Well, yeah, it's a good one. It's really hot over here in the U.S. and education and so on, and it's all the rage. So, the claim is that different kids have different learning style. Some kids are better visual learners, or other kids are better verbal learners, and the idea is you try to. It's not an implausible idea. I mean, I think the idea isn't necessarily so silly on the surface. The idea is if you try to match the kids' learning style to your teaching and vice versa. So if the kid tends to learn more verbally, well, you want to use more words. If the kid is more of a spatial learner, then try to match the kid's learning to that. So a couple of problems. First of all, there may be some learning styles, but I think they're a lot more variable even within kids than people think. So that's one big problem, is this idea that some kids are more verbal across the board is maybe a little dubious, or that more spatial across the board is kind of dubious. That's one big problem. I think the bigger problem, though, is this, what's sometimes called this matching hypothesis, this idea that if a kid is a verbal learner, you therefore want to teach them a more verbal mode, or if the kid's more of a spatial learner. And so therefore, if you want to teach kids math concepts, maybe some kids actually learn better by words, and other kids learn better by making shapes of the numbers and things like that. Or some kids may be more kinesthetic learners, so maybe you want to have them, if you want to teach them how to add, maybe have them get in front of the class and make movements, sort of showing how to add numbers together.
You must have seen the Onion article about parents of nasal learners feel discriminated against.
I like that already a lot, yeah.
But so good. So what does the research say then?
Yeah, most of the research, with a few exceptions, shows that matching teaching styles, learning styles doesn't really help learning very much. Doesn't seem to result in much of a boost. So it's probably not that useful a strategy. And my bigger concern, actually, and here the research, I think, admittedly, is more mixed, but my bigger concern is I worry it may do harm because kids, after all, have to learn to develop their weaknesses. So my worry is if you teach away from their weaknesses, you might actually allow those weaknesses to get stronger. And that's not very good. The analogy I always gave was when I was playing soccer in high school. I was never very good, but I liked to play soccer. And I was on my soccer team for a very short while. So I dropped off because I didn't like the coach very much. But I was never good with my left foot. I'm right leg dominant, right foot dominant. And one of the things you learn in playing soccer is if you're not very good with your left foot, for example, you actually want to learn to play to it. You don't want to start ignoring. It's just going to become weaker. And that's one of my big concerns about this learning style stuff is it not only doesn't work, but I think it may in the long run actually backfire because it just encourages people to focus only on their strengths. But to be a well-rounded teacher, a well-rounded employee, you've got to be able to be diverse and be versatile.
Yeah, well, very interesting. Yeah, that's funny. I probably cut out to be an academic. My organized sports career ended when I was in 5th grade. But
I didn't go much further either. So
found out my aptitudes were in other areas. Yeah, so that's really useful. And is there a meta-analysis that or a systematic review that you could point listeners to? I'll put the notes in the chat. I mean, I don't know how many of my listeners are going to go up and look up a meta-analysis, but just in case.
Yeah, there have been some good reviews. One was by, I'll get the exact reference, but I know Hal Pashler and Rohrer and a few others did one in the journal Psychological Science and the Public Interest a bit less than a decade ago where they reviewed all of that evidence.
Actually, they should just really get your book because there's 50 of them in there and there are 50 meta-analysis or systematic reviews. It's 2010. Have they asked you for a second edition yet, by the way, of Great Myths?
Well, we've been kind of delinquent about that. That's on our list of things to do. It's weighing on me because the book is parts of it are getting a bit outdated, and we need to update some of the myths and probably pick a couple of new ones. So
sure, of course, yeah. Is it still in print, by the way? It's still, yeah, fabulous. That's really great, man. That's now almost a decade. Super. All right, let me pick one more. Left brain, right brain. So again, I hear this so often. Okay, so there is an anatomical difference between the left brain and the right brain, and there are functional differences between the left brain and the right brain. So why are we making a mistake when we're talking about left brain people and right brain thing or right brain leadership? Why are we making all these mistakes?
Yeah, right. So that's a good question, Paul. I think one thing listeners have to keep in mind is that a lot of these myths have a little bit of a kernel of truth in them, and this is one that's probably not entirely wrong, but it's way overblown. So it is true. Going back to some classic split brain studies of Sperry, who won the Nobel Prize, and Michael Gazzaniga and others, it is true the left and right hemispheres in most people tend to have somewhat different specializations. The left hemisphere is a little more specialized for verbal ability and maybe analytical ability. Right hemisphere is a bit more spatial and so on. But those are only differences in degree. They're not differences in kind. And we know that assuming someone has an intact corpus callosum, which is the big band of fibers that connects the two hemispheres, and an intact anterior commissure, which is another band of fibers, the two hemispheres are constantly in contact, constantly communicating with each other.
Yeah.
And again, these are differences that are really kind of shades of gray. They're not absolute differences. So it's very unlikely that certain people are entirely left-brained or entirely right-brained. So
right.
It doesn't quite work that simply. And it also does relate in some ways to the learning styles myth, because a lot of teachers and other entrepreneurs will say, oh, gee, let's give this person a test to see whether they're more a left brain or right brain person or something, and then try to then give them some advice as to how to proceed with that. It's very unlikely that's going to work because, again, what people forget is that, guess what? We're complicated as humans, and rarely are people entirely verbal or entirely spatial, entirely analytical. A lot of these things are very domain specific, so many of us can be quite analytical in the case of some problem, especially something we know well. And then when it comes to other things, particularly when strong emotion kicks in, when we have motivated reasoning, but it's oftentimes logic and analysis goes out the window.
Yep.
We're all prone to that.
Right. So difference in degree and not in kind. The hemispheres are in communication all the time. And in anything complex, a lot of the brain is working on problems. So people aren't, I mean, is there some truth to the fact that right brain people have these gross macro? Are they more creative as they'd like to believe?
Well, the way I would put it is that, so I wouldn't put it that way. The way I put it is that some people are more creative than others, and those people probably do invest more of their right brain in some activities. But I'm not sure. Sort of, this relates to a broader problem, which we don't talk too much about in that book, but some others relates to a broader problem that my good friend Sally Satel has called neuroredundancy. It's not clear what more information you get from that than just knowing the person is creative. We already know some people are more creative than others. I'm not sure invoking the fact that they may have more right brain activation is necessarily telling us a whole lot, although it may strike some people as more scientific.
All right, well, let's talk specifically about your favorite. Out of the 50 great myths of popular psychology that are featured in your book, which one is the one that you think, I don't know, pick anything you like, is the most valuable or the most insightful or the most damaging or some sort of attribute?
That's a tough one. I do get asked that, and I'm never sure which one to pick. I'll tell you one that I think is one of the most pervasive and maybe arguably one of the most damaging, just because it's so much in popular culture, is this, again, there probably has a core of truth in it, but I think the myth, the way I would frame it, is that the major determinant of our happiness is what happens to us. I think that's, in some way, really one of the most pernicious myths. No doubt, in terms of short-term happiness, we all know when good things happen to us, if we do well on an exam or get a job or promotion, we're gonna be happy. But Dan Gilbert and others have written about this far better than I have. We often overestimate the longevity of our emotions, and we often think that, gee, all I've got to do if I'm desperately unhappy in my job, all I've got to do is find a different job because the grass is going to be greener on the other side. Now, that's not to say that if you're unhappy in a job, you should look around. I have. I mean, we all, well, and sometimes you do have to make moves, but I think the mistake people make is most literature shows that the main determinant of our happiness is probably more how we view what happens to us than what actually happens to us objectively. So,
yes,
this is important. I used to do clinical work as a psychotherapist, and I would always encounter certain people who, no matter what job they're in, are always unhappy, or whatever relationship they're in is unhappy. And sometimes what you have to realize is someone who has that kind of tendency is, some people maybe are very unlucky and have black clouds walking around, black clouds above their head wherever they go. Sometimes that can happen, but more often than not, what's happening is that people are viewing things through particular lenses and are happy with whatever their life experiences are. And conversely, we also know people who have had horrific life circumstances, and these are remarkable people. I've known some of them who manage to stay happy regardless of what happens to them. So sure. I think this myth is pernicious because it can often lead us to look outside of us rather than inside of us.
Sure.
I think rather than saying I need to maybe change the way I view the world and try to find ways of coping better and developing more positive attitude, we feel, all I've got to do is find a different boyfriend, girlfriend, spouse, job, etc.
Sure, or a better car, or move to California or wherever. Yeah, absolutely.
Or in case of parents who are or individuals who are in an unhappy marriage, all we have to do is have kids, and now we'll suddenly be happy. And we know that's not going to work because, if anything, marital happiness tends to go down after having kids, at least in the short run.
I mean, you tell me if this is right. So this hypothesis that I have is that our culture, in the United States particularly, but also being unhappy is so culturally legitimate. I mean, if you go in the bookstores, or if you look at the covers of magazines, or if you look at people's displays on social media or on Twitter, there's this tremendous, if you ask people how they're doing, it's like another day in paradise. One of the exercises I do in leadership training is to ask people to describe, their life and their emotional life. And it's always this curve that goes up like this. There's a certain like social legitimacy to being happy. And what I think, and this is my hypothesis, please comment, is that people get unhappy about being unhappy. Like, there are people who are more melancholy, but in our culture, there's a sort of, they're almost stigmatized to the point of being unhappy about being unhappy, if you will. What do you make of that as an idea?
I do think there's some truth to that, Paul. Barbara Ehrenreich and others have written about this, that Barbara Ehrenreich, as you may know, a journalist, had breast cancer and fortunately survived it. And she experienced this the same kind of thing where, with other cancer survivors and people were undergoing this terrible experience, there was almost a sense of, cheer up, what's wrong with you? You don't want to be unhappy. And obviously being unhappy is a lot less fun than being happy. But after all, I tend to think that natural selection was fairly wise and imbued us with a big palette of emotions, and that sadness plays a role in everyday life, and it gives richness and depth to our experience. And sometimes it's adaptive to be unhappy, and it's fine to be sad after certain experiences. Of course, if it persists too much, that's not good. But I do worry, like you, that the field of positive psychology, which I think has some good things to it, I don't think
sure does. Yeah,
I think there've been some useful insights, but I think sometimes it's almost become this field of what's sometimes been derided as happyology, that we want to somehow extirpate all negative emotions like anger and guilt and sadness. Well, it's a somewhat different answer, but in our lab we study people who don't have much guilt or shame, and they're called psychopaths. So being able to feel guilt, for example, and along with other negative emotions like sadness is part of being a healthy person, so long as it doesn't get too extreme.
And our affective life is genetically determined to a great extent. Our the level of our neuroticism, or if you want our baseline level of happiness, there's a genetic correlate to that. Am I wrong? I think I'm correct about that.
There definitely, I would say there's certainly substantial genetic influences on these traits. They're not by any means determined. We can shift,
sure,
but some people have argued that for happiness there is a kind of fairly stable set point that we bounce around. Now, that's to say that certain impactful life events, both good or bad, can't shift our set points around. I think, I could be wrong about this, but I think that highly effective psychotherapy, although it may take a while, can sometimes shift our set points around. But it's true that there is a kind of stability in mood across all of us, and that many of us, especially over long spans of time, if something good happens, we'll feel happy right afterwards, but we'll often revert back to something close to our baseline.
Yeah, that's the way, I'm glad you've illuminated that for me. That's the way I sort of understood the research, that people who lose their legs may be unhappy for long periods of time, but you revert to something like a baseline. And people who win the lottery may be briefly very, very happy, but over time they'll revert to their pre-existing beltline, which is culturally determined, and it may be genetically determined, and it's determined by history and all of those kind of things.
Yeah, and I think that's mostly right. There's been some research questioning how clear-cut those conclusions are. It probably is true that some very negative life events do shift people downward for long periods of time. Divorce is one that sometimes can really put people into a spiral for a while. But it's also true that people are a lot more resilient than we often give them credit for, and that following either really good or really bad events, we often do experience a shift in emotion, either up or down, but we oftentimes do kind of go back to that. And the problem is, as Dan Gilbert and others have pointed out, we often forget about that. We often overestimate the extent to which our emotions are going to stay the same. So again, if we're in a desperate, unhappy job over and over again, and we can't seem to find any happiness, regardless of what occupation we have, again, we may forget about the fact that if we move to a different job, there's a decent chance that we're going to feel a bit better soon afterwards. But unless we're careful in the way we think about that job and our coping skills, coping styles, we may end up kind of going back to the same level of unhappiness as before.
Yeah, I did in previous life a lot of coaching of career people, and their first response being unhappy at work is change work. And unfortunately, wherever you go, there you are. More or less, you'll replicate to some extent the relationships and the texture of relationships, and your relationship with work will follow you. So I, generally speaking, discourage people until they develop a certain amount of self-understanding and make sure that their unhappiness is actually context-dependent rather than self-dependent, if you will, or something like that. It's not even for listeners, by the way, I do want to say that the way Professor Lilienfeld talks about things is there's degrees of certainty. And sometimes, as a lot of people in the management or coaching profession or something like that, I talk about conclusions as if they're certain. And what's certain about science, and it's absolutely more certain about psychological science, is that we are talking always about degrees of uncertainty. And do you think that's more true for the psychological sciences, the social sciences, than it is for the physical sciences? Or
I do. I think you put it well. I think that's true. I mean, all sciences are somewhat probabilistic, but I think in social science in particular, I think that our conclusions have to be somewhat more uncertain and probabilistic, partly because there are just so many other variables that impact our behavior. A carbon atom is pretty much a carbon atom, and obviously isotopes and things like that, but our behavior is affected by our other personality traits, our attitudes, our interests, the experiences, previous life experiences we've had, our current situations, our culture, our race, our expectations, there's so many. Sometimes people criticize us in psychology with some justification about how crappy we are at predicting behavior. We're not very good at it. But sometimes it amazes me that we can predict behavior at all with any degree of certainty above chance, given how many hundreds of factors are impinging on our behavior at any given time.
Right. Yes. Yes, I do wonder. I had a great conversation with Massimo Pigliucci about this, about whether, in fact, one way of thinking about it is the social sciences, psychology, are where chemistry was in the 1700s or the 1600s, in the sense that we're able to be, our understanding of the physical world was, pretty rapid between 1700 and 1900, and our methods improved alongside, and whether our social science methods, understanding the complexity, we just don't have the appropriate technology and tools and methods we might have in 100 years. I guess this is an idea I hope I have, that social science will evolve and we'll see the kind of breakthroughs that we saw in physics in the beginning of the 20th century. What do you think about that? Kind of a speculative idea, but
I hope so. I'm not sure, but I hope
so. It's object of truth. Anyway, let's talk about neuroscience. Anyway, that's funny. So I'm in the management consulting. Well, not anymore, but I used to be a management consultant and leadership guy. And about a decade ago, the leadership world went nuts for neuroscience. There's a Neuro Leadership Institute. There are God knows how many books on neurocoaching. I have people who talk about neurohappiness. I have people who are coaches who talk about neuro reprogramming. So there they are. And I think you used the quote in your book. I think it's from Jonah Lehrer, who says that if Andy Warhol were alive today, he'd be painting brain scans, not Campbell soup cans. Is that right? Is that what he said?
That's right.
Yeah, it's good. So you wrote a book, which I think is a seminal cautionary, I don't want to say critical, because I mean it's affirming in some place, but a cautionary tale about using neuroscience in neuro law, neuromarketing, neuro leadership. Why is the current state of science and art, why the current applications of neuroscience, why is that worrisome to you before we sort of get into specifics?
Yeah, so I should say up front, I'm glad you framed our book that way, because I'm a fan of neuroscience. I'm kind of a neuroscience nerd. I like reading about the brain. It's fascinating. And I think we have made some remarkable advances in terms of technology, and we're learning a lot more about the biological correlates of mental illness, which is a big interest of mine, and so on. But I also think that one problem we sometimes have in psychology and other fields is we allow the claims to run way ahead of the data. And I think one of the big problems is that there are enormous, not to get too technical here, but there are enormous explanatory gaps between what we know about the brain and what we know about behavior. So we can often describe what's going on at the neural level fairly well, but how that actually connects up to what we actually do and what our thinking is we're not even close to that understanding. So the problem is it's interesting to learn about the brain functioning, and we talked about how the different hemispheres work, and you mentioned the amygdala earlier. We know the amygdala plays a role in emotional processing, including fear and actually sometimes even happiness. But how that actually connects up to what we do is really still mysterious. There's so many different levels of analysis and gaps. So as a result, in the domain of education, for example, learning about how the brain works is wonderful, but does it actually inform educational practices? It's not at all clear that it does in most cases. Same
right. Neuroeducation, the field of neuroeducation.
That's right. I attended a White House conference a couple of years ago on neural education. I was one of the token skeptics, but I listened to the talks that went on for about 2 days, and they were very interesting. A lot of fascinating talks. I learned some really interesting things. But I would say that coming out of that conference, although I learned some fun things and met some fascinating people, I was left with a feeling like there was really not a single brain-based breakthrough in education, or even a brain-based.
You were more worried than elated, it sounds like to me.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think to say, if I don't want to summarize a complex thinker's words, that you think we're getting ahead of ourselves. I think that's one way of saying what you're saying.
Well, it's the middle of the Winter Olympics now. I'd say we're getting ahead of our skis. That's right. We're getting way ahead of ourselves, and I think we could, even though I think a lot of the neuroscience work is fascinating and very exciting, I also think we need a bit more humility in that field, and a bit more understanding that it's going to take a long time before these breakthroughs actually become translated into reality. I know the education field a little bit. The area I know better is mental illness, because I do work in that field, and there's exciting work in the neuroscience of mental illness. I've done a little bit of it myself, more as a collaborator, because I don't do a lot of direct neuroscience work. And that work is very interesting. But again, I would honestly say, and some of my colleagues might disagree with me, but I would honestly say that I don't think there's been a single neuroscience finding that has directly informed the treatment of any major mental disorder yet. There may be an exception in the case of some mental disorders that may be around the boundaries of neurological disorders, like sleep disorders such as narcolepsy. That may be one exception. But when it comes to what we call the classic mental disorders like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, panic disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, conditions that can be very impairing and cause a lot of distress and impairment for some people, I don't think that any neural work has really told us, okay, what do we now do differently in terms of these conditions? We
are closer on Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. We are closer on the degenerative diseases to neuroanatomy and neuroscience.
Right.
But we're absolutely not there. But we are closer, it seems to me. Is that correct? I don't.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in those, but talking to my colleagues who do work on those areas, I think we're getting closer. But even there with Alzheimer's, it's still not clear what's actually going on. So we know that there are amyloid plaques in the brain, but are those causing the disease? We don't know. Or are they just
correlates? Artifacts. Yeah.
Does if we remove amyloid plaques from the brain, will that cure Alzheimer's? The evidence is still up for grabs.
Yeah. So let's talk about something specific. Again, I guess is it your view that the people who are doing, say, fMRI research, functional magnetic resonance, producing these brain scans, is it them, without kind of, wanting to ascribe blame for this, is it people like who live in the management world and the education world and the world of neurolaw, the marketers and the lawyers, are they getting ahead of themselves are they trying to take the findings of scientists who are applied neuroscientists and trying to apply them to psychological phenomena such as behavior and mental events? Are the people who are doing the neuroanatomy and the neurophysiology and the work on neurotransmitters, is that a robust canon, and it's taken by people outside who say, oh, well, look at this finding. That's remarkable. That means that. Is that kind of what's happening, or are the neuroscientists themselves, if you want, jumping ahead of the game? Because I've always, the stuff I've read, they're always very cautiously expressed findings.
I put a little blame on some neuroscientists, frankly, but I think the substantial majority of the ones I know are very good scientists. They're very cautious and careful. Like any scientists, neuroscientists sometimes get ahead of themselves and don't qualify claims accordingly. But I'm not sure they're any worse than any of us in psychology, for example, or other fields. I think the bigger problem there, because there are a lot of people doing terrific, very high quality, very rigorous neuroscience work, both structural imaging and functional imaging, which you described.
Yeah,
but I think the bigger problem is that a lot of people in these other fields see this stuff as a way of making their field more scientific, and they latch onto this stuff because after all, if people see a brain image, they think, wow, this is, and my stuff was fuzzy before, like coaching, education, that was always kind of a little bit ineffable, unclear, but now I can hitch my wagon to something that's real science, and I can show neurons firing and stuff like that. I think that's the danger, is they may think they're more to be had than is presently there.
Yeah, there's a guy who works in my field called David Rock. I mean, he's in my field, broadly speaking, management. And he's written some very good books, and he's seen as the kind of high temple of neuroleadership. And what I've said is that when what he says is close to neuroscience, when he stays close to the science, he's not useful at all. And when he's far away from the science, some of his models like SCARF and AGES are actually super useful models, I think, for understanding gross macro psychological processes. He's very useful, but it's got absolutely no relationship with neuroscience. So that's my fear, is that the closer to the science it gets, the less useful it becomes. Talk us through your thing about, you gave a great example of a couple in counseling. I thought that was great. I actually stole that from my book.
Yeah.
I think that would be illustrative for listeners.
Right. Well, yeah, I think if there was a couple in counseling that was having a lot of conflict, it might be tempting to stick them both in brain scans and look at how their brains get active or deactivated in response to different statements they make. But I'm not sure it would really help very much. I think it might be worse than useless, because it would be a distraction. I think if a couple's having problems in counseling right now, maybe things will change one day, but right now, I think the most appropriate level of analysis and most appropriate level of intervention is figuring out what they're fighting about. And maybe a temptation to think, gee, all we have to do is get inside their brains.
Yeah.
But right now, it's not going to really tell us a whole lot more than we already know. So again, if we were to find out, for example, if their amygdalas become more active when they get angry at each other, or that we kind of already know the amygdala plays some role in fear and negative emotions, and knowing the amygdala gets activated during arguments probably isn't telling us a whole lot new.
Well, so what, right? Exactly. So it's like, so what? All right. I mean, I say, as honey, when you don't take out the trash, my oxytocin, my serotonin pathways are inhibited, and my dorsolateral prefrontal cortex can't cope. Have I just helped or made it worse?
You just wasted our time, I think, because we kind of do that already, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think, not to get too technical, but I think sometimes we tend to confuse description with explanation, because what's really happening there, if you say, honey, when I feel close to you, my oxytocin levels start firing. Well, yeah, there's probably some truth to that, but we know oxytocin plays a role in social bonding. So what we're probably doing without realizing is we're just describing what's happening, but at a different level of analysis. Yeah.
And not a useful level of analysis. I mean, I use the metaphor, maybe I'm wrong about this, but does understanding the chemical formula for converting octane into carbon dioxide and water that happens in the internal combustion engine help you drive a Ferrari?
That's right.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we'll have this experience where you go to an auto mechanic or something, or I have this thing with you talk to some people in IT and they're trying to explain why your computer isn't working, and they go into all this great level of depth about what's actually happening in the hardware. So I don't need to know that. Just tell me what buttons to push, right? It's like,
that's right.
It doesn't really matter. And again, one day we may be able to bridge that huge explanatory gap between the brain hardware and the brain software, but we're nowhere near there.
So is there any usefulness now at the fields of neuromarketing, neurolaw? I mean, a lot of what people are trying to do is connect anatomical structures of the brain, the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, to psychological events, mental events, and behaviors.
I'm open to it.
What mistake are they making when they try and connect neuroanatomy to behavioral and mental events?
Yeah, I don't know. They're not all making mistakes. I think what I would say is they may be premature. I think that's the big problem. Is that we may not always be there yet. Now, that's not to say that I think there is nothing potentially to neuromarketing and neurolaw. I think it's overhyped, but I don't think it's necessarily wrong. So neuromarketing, for example, I think it's possible that partly because many of us don't often have a lot of insight into our feelings, and some of us have a hard time describing our feelings. In some cases, it's possible that maybe brain activation, for example, in response to a commercial or something, or ad or something, might sometimes be able to better predict our liking of a product than merely reports. I think that's possible. Sometimes also people are reluctant to tell someone in a focus group what they actually think about something, and the brain imaging may reveal that information. In the case of neurolaw, it's possible. I think there's some suggestive evidence for this, that brain activation may in some cases be able to detect lying better than, for example, the standard polygraph machine, which isn't very good at doing that. It's possible that maybe there are subtle brain activations that can pick up the emotions associated with lying better. I'm not close to that. I suspect that a lot of those advances, to the extent they're there, are pretty small, incremental. Mm-hmm. We should benefit from them. I think that it's very likely to me that the brain is going to provide some additional information above and beyond, for example, people's self-reports, what people can say about themselves. But I'm dubious it's going to provide a panacea anytime soon.
Right. Yeah, there's a philosopher, I may have even stolen this quote from Jerry Fodor, who said, he just passed away actually a month ago or something like that, who said, if the mind happens in space at all, it happens somewhere north of the neck. So why does it matter how far north? In other words, when we're studying mental events, the importance of which bits of the brain are involved are less than important. Well, he says unimportant.
Yeah, I don't know if I go quite as far as saying unimportant, but again, I think what we're often doing in these cases is we're kind of doing geography. We're kind of mapping brain activations onto different behaviors. That's, I think, quite interesting and very important. It's good to get a map, but how much that actually helps us to explain or predict behavior, I think, is still not always clear.
Good. So let's, if we can, I think, turn to your new book. We've covered 50 myths, and we've covered a little bit about brainwashed. I want to recommend Brainwashed to people who are, first of all, it'll help you understand neuroscience and cognitive affective neuroscience and some of the field really well. I think it explains it at a level which a layperson can access very easily. But also, it sounds a cautionary tale. So if you're in the field of leadership or in the field of marketing or in the field of executive development or education, and you spend a lot of time, invested in, I always admire people that go to these conferences because they have a hunger for being on the leading edge. And there's, something admirable about that. A lot of the people who are in my business world who are into the neuroscientific aspects of it, I'm not sure there are any neuroscientific, but anyway, the people who are into that are people who are hungry for, expanding the field of your knowledge. So I want to kind of acknowledge that. But anyway, if you want to read something that's cautionary and make sure you don't go too far too fast, then I recommend Brainwashed to listeners. And I'll put a link to the book in my show notes. But let's talk about your new book. Is it your new book? Is it your newest book, Facts and Fictions of Mental Health? Is that the most recent? Gosh, it's only a year old. You can't have written another one since.
That's right. Yeah, we had one other book that's more on we call the replication crisis, but that's more for science nerds. But in terms of the general public, that's kind of our big new book. Yeah.
Well, good. So I have not got a copy of it yet. So talk us through it. Talk us about why you wrote it and what you think is important in it, please.
Yeah. So what this book actually mostly is just a compilation of columns that my good friend and collaborator Hal Arkowitz wrote for the magazine Scientific American Mind, and we also included some new columns, sort of updated and fill in some of the gaps. And what we did in this column and what the book does is to, in some ways, go a bit beyond our 50 myths book and tackle both well-supported data, but also common misunderstandings, misconceptions, myths about mental illness and its treatment. So that's what we do. So we tackle common myths about things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, suicide, and so on. There's so many of these. One that's timely here in the U.S. is the link between mental illness and violence. Studies show that many people in the general public think that the substantial majority of people who are mentally ill are physically violent, when we know that's not true. The overwhelming majority of people with mental illness, or including schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, are not violent. Mm-hmm. And in fact, when violence does occur, they're much more likely to be the victims of violence than the perpetrators.
No, that's also interesting. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, and the data are very consistent on that. And we're probably, for schizophrenia, we're probably looking at well under 5% of them will ever do anything violent. Now, that's not to say that, like many myths, there's a kernel of truth that it is true that people with severe mental illnesses, particularly if they have paranoia, and also if they're using drugs or drinking, are at somewhat higher risk. So there's probably a somewhat increased risk, but again, at an absolute level, the overwhelming majority of people with severe mental illness will never commit any violence. And again, that has implications for example, gun debates, and that I can't resolve here, but many people think, all we have to do to solve the problem of violent crime in the U.S. is to improve mental health care. That may be part of the problem, that may be part of the solution, but I'm not sure that's going to be sufficient. So that's one of the many myths that we tackle, and we try to do our best to replace some of the misinformation with more accurate information.
So let's talk about something that, I've, been in treatment for depression, not in treatment, sort of counseling for depression and various times during my life. So what are some of the myths about depression that listeners might find illuminating?
Yeah, so we do talk about that. So I think there are a lot of myths about depression. I think maybe the most pernicious myth, perhaps, is that depression is just a kind of sad mood. I think a lot of people don't quite realize how serious and debilitating a true clinical depression can be, and I think that's a very common mistake people make. Like, oh, you're just in a sad mood, get over it. And
sure, get over it, or get out and do something. Why don't you get out and do something? Go enjoy yourself.
People forget that. That's right. People forget that in a serious depression, what we call anhedonia, which is a serious inability to experience loss or an interest or pleasure, is one of the most common features. It's not invariable, but it's certainly one of the most common features of depression. That's certainly one myth. I think people oftentimes underestimate how severe, impairing, distressing true depression can be. I think there are also myths about the causes of depression. A lot of people think that depression is caused by a simple chemical imbalance in the brain, and that seems to be a gross oversimplification. It's not like although there may be undoubtedly there are biological correlates of depression, and there may be very subtle kinds of imbalances in the brain. It's not a simple chemical imbalance. Like all we got to do is add more serotonin to the brain or something, and that's going to change everything. It's not that simple. So that's I think.
Oh, don't we wish it were, right? Don't we wish it were?
Yeah, and I think another big myth, by the way, is that, which I see very often, is that myths go multiple ways, but one common myth is that medications, for example, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac and so on, are all you need to treat depression. And I think they can be helpful. There was a meta-analysis, a kind of quantitative review that just came out in the journal Lancet that does suggest that these medications can be more helpful than placebo or dummy pills. But by the same token,
but not by much, right? It's a funny thing.
There's probably about a 20-25% edge above and beyond the placebo sugar, but which is not trivial, but it's not always gigantic.
Yeah.
But be that as it may, I think they can play a role, and I think they do work for many people. But the literature also is very consistent in showing that good psychotherapy adds substantially to the effectiveness of those medications. So especially for moderate to severe depression, probably a combination of medication, evidence-based psychotherapy is going to be most effective.
Yeah, that's what I've read, that basically between the two of them, if you get depression in a pincer effect, that you can actually be quite efficacious in treatment of it. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, that's good. So what about addiction? What are some of the most harmful myths about addiction?
Yeah, so we do touch on addiction as well, and we do touch in particular on addiction treatments. And there are a lot of myths about those as well. So
this is when I come out of the closet. I haven't had a drink or a controlled substance in 25 years. So, and I started in Alcoholics Anonymous, and what you're taught in Alcoholics Anonymous is that only Alcoholics Anonymous and only 100% abstinence.
Yeah.
You're sober. And, I'll tell you, Scott, just personally, I'm sort of glad I thought that back then. I don't believe that now. I abstain. I haven't changed my abstinence practice, but I'm sort of glad that for 2 or 3 years, even though it's a false belief, that it was actually a very helpful false belief. So what's the state of the science on addiction recovery and abstinence?
As long as it works for you, just go with it, right? I
mean, well, yeah, the fact is you don't know, though. That's unfortunate.
But so that's always been a very contentious topic and a very controversial one that gets.
And you get people who are a long time sober who will get really upset if you say that.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But what
really
I say is, I think abstinence only interventions. My reading literature is they probably are often a good idea for very, very severe people with very, very severe alcohol use disorder. So I think for people where it's very, very severe. Obviously, they want to consult with their therapist, consult with doctors, but that may be, in some cases, the best option. However, what's not true is the view that abstinence is always the best goal. And we know that there are clearly a number of people who can return to moderate or controlled drinking and do that successfully.
Yeah.
Not everybody can pull it off, but a lot of people can. So I think that's an oversimplified view. But again, there is a core of truth in it, and it's a kind of thing you really have to think through carefully with your physician, with your therapist, and so on. The other, I think for me, the concern I have is that some individuals may fall prey to what's been termed the abstinence violation effect.
Yes.
In some ways, it could actually backfire because after all, there's a difference, as they often say, there's a difference between a lapse and a relapse, and even when someone's trying not to drink again, really the fact that they might lapse into having a drink or two doesn't necessarily mean in all cases that they're going to now become alcoholic again. And the abstinence violation effect is the fact that there's actually some evidence suggesting that if people really have a very, very strong abstinence goal, if they have one drink, they might figure, oh, okay, I've blown it. I might as well just kind of keep drinking.
Fuck it.
Or something.
That's it. Yeah. That's AA. That's Alcoholics Anonymous dogma. That what they say is the first drink does the damage, and
one drink.
And that's it. Yeah. And that's an unhelpful. I mean, there might be some truth to it, as with all these things, but I mean, it's an unhelpful narrative to believe that. Oh, I've had a glass of champagne at my daughter's wedding. Now I'm forever fucked. Now I'm an alcoholic again. That could be unhappy. I mean, people go further in addiction recovery and they say that you actually need to believe in a higher power, which I, for a time, did. And again, I would call that a false belief now. I don't want to be offensive to people who do, but I would call it a false belief now. But I'm bloody glad that for the first 3 years of recovery that I had a sort of these false beliefs. So it's kind of an interesting thing as someone who's interested in reason, rationality, and science, that I had these, what I think are probably false beliefs, but my interpretation now is that they're actually very useful to have them. So
that's right. And I think for listeners, I think it's important to know that Alcoholics Anonymous and some of these other treatments, Narcotics Anonymous, I think can be helpful for some people. I think literature shows that they can be helpful. So I don't want to dispute that. I think AA can be helpful for a lot of purposes. I think particularly the emotional support that it provides and the listening it provides and so on. Some of the skills it provides can be very, very helpful. But I also think it's important for people to know there are multiple options that seem to work for alcohol treatment. There's
in the United States, you won't find that. But you won't find that. I mean, the addiction recovery world is dominantly 12-step influences in the United States, isn't it?
Yeah. But there are other options too.
Yeah.
I think increasingly there's much more variety, I think, in the U.S. than there once was.
Perhaps, yeah. I mean, I found the community was the most important thing. The fact that I could hang around with a bunch of people and have a good time and talk through stuff that was uncomfortable or unpleasant or painful and not be. I found that was by far extraordinarily useful. But yeah,
so support plays a big role in recovery, and even just knowing that other people will be A, there to support you, and B, might kind of give you a hard time if you don't get your act together. That kind of thing could be immensely helpful in recovery.
Well, it sounds like a great book. And really, with all of the stigma and all of the false beliefs about mental illness, we're perhaps exacerbating the problem or missing out on important treatments. And so I'm really grateful that you've stuck the book out there. I'm going to get a hold of it myself, and I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes. So what are you, before we leave, what are you up to now? What's cooking for you? And I guess more importantly, where can listeners find you if they want to find your stuff?
Yeah, so I'm at Emory University in Atlanta, and
you're a Northeastern guy, though, aren't you?
That's right. That's exactly right. I'm from New York City originally. Grew up a couple of blocks away from a man who's been on the news occasionally. A man named what's his name? Donald J. Trump. Yeah, grew up.
You're from Queens?
A few blocks away from him in Jamaica Estates, New York.
Right, great. Yeah, very good.
One of my friends.
But you didn't go into real estate.
Not go to real estate. That's nothing I ever had an interest or aptitude in. But yeah. But I'm at Emory University, Atlanta, so people can contact me. So what am I working on? We're doing a lot of stuff in our lab. So in our lab, we do a lot of work on psychopathic personality and narcissistic personality, something that may have some relevance to today's politics. And we also are getting very interested in the psychology of cognitive biases, something you covered in your podcast. And in particular, we're interested in, we haven't really done too much work on this, but we're beginning to get quite interested in personality variables, attitudinal variables that might mitigate against cognitive biases, like intellectual humility, for example, and a variable that my friend Gina Gorlin calls cognitive integrity. So, and are there ways of maybe training people to become more humble in a way that might diminish their risk of their own biases, or at least falling prey to those biases?
Wow, that's something that I've not read. I mean, something I've studied in enormous detail is the work of Kahneman and subsequent, and well, it's a very hot area, generally speaking, right now. And actually, there are attitudinal adjustments that people can make, non-trivial attitudinal adjustments. Because, I mean, our world today is full of people who are dogmatically sure about climate change, there are very few people in the world that can speak authoritatively about climate change, but everybody seems to have like extremely vociferous opinions about it. And similarly true with people with familiarity with gun research or the problems we face today. So there's an enormous polarization of ignorant people yelling at each other from both sides. So if you can find a way to help us with that.
You mentioned Kahneman. Daniel Kahneman in an interview was asked if he could wave a magic wand, what cognitive flaw, frailty would he most want to get rid of? And he said overconfidence. And I think you're exactly right. We live in a culture now where we seem to live in a culture of certainty, where everyone's sure about things, even if they've had almost no training in it. And I think that's right. But in all fairness, we as a field, and I'm guilty of this too, we've focused a lot on biases, but very little on what's been called debiasing. There's certainly research on debiasing and a lot more interest in it, but we don't know all that much about how how to do it. I think one of the challenges to debiasing is motivation. So I think even if we were to develop good debiasing interventions, would people really care about it? So if there was a very strong gun control advocate or gun control supporter, either
does he care about
with evidence that might question their views, are they going to be interested in looking at it? That's the harder part, and that's one reason I think why we're actually getting interested in things like intellectual humility and so on, trying to see if that can be trained up. Is I think one may almost need a whole, and one may have to start. I don't know the answer to this, but one may have to start very early in education and really try to imbue that in kids, sort of an attitude that part of being a good citizen, part of being a educated person, a wise person, is being able to see perspectives that differ from one's own. I don't think that's something we're doing very well at in educating kids these days.
Will you send me a link to, what you would consider the most accessible or interesting piece on debiasing by email so I can put it in the show notes? I'm certainly going to pursue it myself. I'm writing a book called Truth Wars, which is sort of about rational. I mean, I'm interested in how truth is corrupted by the media, but also by corporations. How we're systematically lied to in areas like tobacco, which still costs 500,000 deaths a year. Somehow or another, magically, it's still legal. So that's the book, and also the polarization in our politics. We can't make decisions democratically now because we don't have a share. Is unemployment higher or lower? Is the climate hot or cold? Or questions like that. So I really do anticipate trouble. So this is so relevant to my research and thinking. I'd be very, very grateful. You've been super generous with your time. I really appreciate it. You're doing such great stuff. Are you now an experimental psychologist? Because I read your work as someone who's more of almost more of a philosopher. You're at the end of things. Are you doing experimental psychology in your lab right now?
Yeah, we do. We don't so much run experiments. We do a little bit of that. We do more what's called correlational work. We kind of look at naturally occurring differences. But yeah, we probably 75% of the stuff we do is actually research. So we measure people we study college students. We measure people in the community. We sometimes done work on prisoners and so on, and we give them all kinds of measures and study them and
prisoners like undergraduates, those prisoners.
Well, they're a captive audience after all. So my students are all doing actual work where we're testing them on personality traits, and again, we're getting interested in not just traits like more negative or maladaptive traits like psychopathic personality, but maybe things that are a bit more on the positive end of the spectrum, like humility and so on.
That's great. Well, look, I want to thank you enormously for your time. We'll stop it there. Thanks. Thank you, by the way. We're out now. So I just, it's so grateful. It was just such an illuminating conversation for me. And you speak as with authority and humility, which is something we need more of in the damn world, don't we?
I don't know about that, but I try.
Yeah, it's much appreciated. Good luck with everything. I'll put links to all your books in the show notes. If there's anything small or large I could do for you, please let me know. I really appreciate your generosity.
You asked great questions, and it was a lot of fun. We could do it again at some point. So,
all right, thank you, Scott.
I'll send you a link to some debiasing stuff over the weekend.
Fabulous. Have a great weekend.
Thanks again, Paul. Great seeing you. All right, bye
bye.
In this section of the show, I get to do something really interesting. Usually, I present books that I'm reading, or books from authors, or books I recommend, or movies I recommend, or documentaries I recommend. But today, I'm going to be hosting an event, and that's what I'd like to put your way. It's a free event. It's going to be a Zoom seminar, and it's going to be with one of my earlier guests called Paul Levinson. If you recall, Paul Levinson and I talked about fake news. He's an expert on fake news. He's been on CNN. He's been on the O'Reilly Factor. He's, one of the leading commenters on fake news, on the phenomenon, and where we might be going with it, and what some of the troubles are, and some of the ways we need to think about getting out in front of fake news before it destroys, the fact base of our society, the basis on which we make our decisions. So that event is going to be the evening, Wednesday, the 28th. I'll be more precise about the time a bit closer. It's going to be Paul Levinson. It's going to be on Zoom. I'm going to limit it to 25 people. It's going to be interactive, so you'll be able to do an Ask Me Anything. You'll be able to ask he or I any question that you like in fake news, or about what's hot on Netflix, or anything that catches your fancy. So what I'd like you to do, if you'd like to attend that event, is send me an email. Find my email on my website, paul@paulgivens.net, www.paulgivens.net. Find an email, drop me an email. Let me put you on the list of invitees. I'm going to cap it at 25 because otherwise I think it's going to be too cumbersome. And I look forward to having listeners on the show. It'll be just really fantastic chance to hear firsthand from listeners what they think of the show that I did with Paul Levinson and, other shows we've done. So very excited to do that. Do send me an email if you'd like to attend. And thanks. That's all for now. To celebrate the launch of the show, and to thank you all for listening, I'm going to be giving away books. Lots and lots of books. All you have to do is leave a review in iTunes. We're going to raffle off a book every single week for 12 weeks. So head on over to paulgibbons.net/iTunes to get easy-to-follow directions and let me know the title of your review to make sure that you're entered to win. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Think Bigger, Think Better. Great ideas are great, but this isn't gospel. Share your critical thinking in the comments. Where do I disagree? What insights were most powerful? If you got value, don't forget to share the value by sharing the podcast. Finally, to get information on book and blog releases and new video content, head over to paulgibbons.net and join the community of thinkers talking about using science and philosophy to make our world a better place.